My name's Erik Alexander. I'm the executive director of the Brigham Education Institute. I welcome everyone here, many from inside the Brigham and Harvard Medical School world and many from outside. So I welcome everyone together. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to now share my screen and we can start our talk here over the next roughly 45 minutes. And I've been tasked with this hot topic, which is how do you find financial support to be a medical educator? And I'll work through an outline and whatnot ahead, but I'm going to take kind of a double perspective to this. When usually some people hear a title like this, they're going to say, maybe it's going to be a talk where people are telling me what granting agencies and what other scholarships are possibly out there. And we will get into that a little bit at the end, but I'm going to take a different perspective as well, a secondary view, which is also how you're really aligning yourself as an individual as a healthcare educator and finding the way to support that mission that you have of education within that process. And you'll see where I'm going here ahead. So that is the outline. I'm going to start kind of with that secondary piece and by asking the question, well, what really is a medical educator, a healthcare educator? What does that job entail? And then as we think about that, I want to kind of almost give guidance on growing in that role. How do you fund your day-to-day job? How do you, what should you expect? What is reasonable? And really a piece of becoming this healthcare educator and getting some money behind it is growing yourself in that role. Then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about specific scholarship opportunities, granting opportunities that are out there and how to think about that. And hopefully a lot of time for question and answer as well. So let's start with a little bit of some self-reflection. So I think to everyone on the call, if you could kind of analyze your job right now, just to yourself, and ask yourself, how do you think about the different pieces of your job, which is how much might be clinical, how much might be research, how much is just doing administration, leadership, but in particular, how much is education? And out of curiosity, let's do a little poll. And I'll ask Caitlin here if she can actually launch the poll. And so the piece that we'll ask you to enter in is the percentage in your 100% effort of your job. What's the percentage that you think in your role is education right now? Everyone, please vote. Excellent. All right, we can stop that polling and share some results here. And what you can begin to see, which I think is always why it's so valuable, is we're a little bit all over the map, that as a community of healthcare educators, there are a lot of different ways that we put together the pieces of being an educator into our kind of full-time job. So I think the other piece of self-reflection a little bit is thinking where you're at right now as we think about kind of growth and how to fund that growth. You want to ask yourself always, what changes would you like to see in the relatively medium term ahead? We'll say that's 1 to 3 years. And if you don't really know where you'd want to go, that's something probably to put on your to-do list. That is worth the reflection. Because when we talk about how to then get to that point, it's going to be talking about prioritizing all the pieces that fall into everyone's job, that we all do multiple things, but yet the system and each of our careers will continue to evolve. They never really stay static for too long. In fact, if you do, someone else likely is going to do something new that begins to take a priority. But what we always want to do together is prioritize what we think are the highest yield next steps for us and to do a good job in those areas so we keep moving forward. All right, so you heard me say earlier that a big piece of kind of finding funding here as an educator is to acknowledge that we are medical educators, clinician educators in some form. And I like to begin this process by saying, about 25 years ago, there really was no answer to what an educator was, but now there is. And what happened a lot many years ago, especially for physician educators, is that they were simply asked to do some teaching in addition to what was expected to be their academic role. But I think a real change about 25 years ago was that idea that now we were actually building and growing a skill set to be a medical educator. And to me, I like this second bullet, this kind of definition that when you answer the question, what is it? Well, a medical educator is really someone who's trained and has really that expertise in two different areas. It's really the social science of education, but applies his or her skills to the medically oriented structure and community, which is really a world of more physical and life sciences, all for the purposes of promoting healthcare learning. So the reason I bring that up is to acknowledge kind of the natural tension and complexity that we should all view from the start, that a social science is very different from a physical science And when you apply more of a physical science to the real world, we refer to that as a life science. And so therein lies kind of how your mindset will change often from moment to moment, day to day, as you're doing something different. When you're treating a patient, you're going to often be really applying that understanding of the biomedical sciences. When you then go to teach, you really are trying to embrace the core social science principles. So along the way here, I'm going to also give you a few tips. These are just my own tips. And obviously you'll continue to get others from other mentors that you have. But the first tip here to kind of stress it to everyone is when I think about building someone as a healthcare educator, I'll often tell them, hey, make sure as you are growing in your career that you are learning the skill set to teach. And I think that's certainly the case for many of you, because we're all in this together and are part of many BEI programs, both as participants and oftentimes as program leaders. So that's certainly how you're doing that. What does a medical educator do? And I like to often kind of start with this high-level premise, this dichotomy, that for most of us, not all, but for most of us who are medical educators, we would argue that there's some portion that is clinical care, that you're doctoring, you're providing clinical care somehow day to day in some portion of your week. And then the other piece to it, of course, is that you're the educator. You're teaching, administrating education, or advancing the teaching process. And again, why is that the case, and why are these two things happening? Well, the first part, I think it's good to just get in front of and put it out there that we often are doing the clinical piece because that's why we often went into healthcare. First and foremost is that we wanted to make a difference in terms of someone's healthcare and their life, and so we wanted to be a healthcare worker. But it's also important to note that as an educator, being in the real world and caring for people and then still being in that academic mission, that's important to give you perspective on how best you are educating in your environment and how you're evolving that over time. I also think it's very much, it gives you legitimacy as a clinician educator to show your talents. I think if you are not clinically active and doing that kind of work, that people will suddenly realize you're a little out of touch. And then the final piece, of course, is we shouldn't ever ignore that the clinical piece brings in revenue. That's often why we're paid for our job. And so you can leverage that for what often is not bringing in revenue, which is the teaching component. So when I go down then to the teaching component, I want to acknowledge this can mean a lot of things, but the goal here is for you to get paid for this activity to some degree too. And this is kind of how I think about that process. To me, there's three goals that kind of lie ahead. If I was coaching a clinician educator, a healthcare educator, for how to think about growing their career and get some money to support that piece as an educator. And goal number one is simple. It is very early on, you should identify yourself as a clinician educator, that's what you like doing, that's what you want to do, and you hope that you can get paid for it. And as you're negotiating even the first of your faculty roles or your new employments, I think you want to be able to say that and say, I'd love to get a little bit of time paid for in that 100% FTE that I have to do that educating and teaching role. And it's important that I think all of us know that even a small percentage, 5 or 10% of your time that is paid to do something in the educational world, it gives you more than you think. And you should value this the minute you can kind of grab that and try and obtain it. And most of the time, someone who's giving you 100% within an academic medical center, your boss, if you will, 5% of having time to do something is often doable in that initial contract. But when you go and ask for that, this sounds quite obvious, but the next question that will come to you is very much one of, well, what do you want to do with that 5 or 10%? So you should have that answer ready. What kind of educating are you doing? And where do you see that kind of piece of educating or teaching and learning going? And sometimes that is something where you just start doing it for free because you're asked to always teach that lecture every 2 weeks in that portion of a training program. But then you can kind of use that to say, I've been doing that for 6 months through a portion of my time, and now I want to really solidify it, because that's going to become the piece that you own, and it's going to become very valuable to you ahead. Once you kind of have that small piece, and this is really just planting the seed of time and ability to be this clinician educator, Once you have, are hopefully given that small piece of time, you want to create a lot of efficiencies around it and put together that idea of a 5-day ideal working week. How do you create then to make a little bit more time perhaps out of that small 5 to 10%? And everyone's scenario is different. But here's an example for a starting point. If I'm dealing sometimes with a clinician and they're very much ambulatory facing, they'll come to me and say, well, normally a full-time job in my area is going to be 8 clinics a week out of 5 days. But they told me that they would hire me for 7 clinics a week. And they said that one extra could be something I can use to do some educational initiatives. So when I get something like that, usually I would have people come to me 6 months later and say, I just am not finding ways to take advantage of the extra clinic that they gave me free to do kind of education. It seems like I'm just swamped with my 7 clinics. And then when you unpack it a little bit more, I've had sometimes scenarios where you find out that they are still doing at least 1 clinic Monday through Friday. And in fact, some days they have 1 clinic at one site, and in the afternoon, they have to drive to another site. And so when I'm speaking about efficiencies, the idea there is, try and create both your clinics morning and afternoon at the same location, because at least you'll be afforded an hour or 2 of a break, perhaps in between, or perhaps routinely always just ask if you can get that Friday afternoon free, so it becomes your kind of academic day, something like that. If you ever can get down to having a whole day free, make sure it's not 2 half days, make sure it's 1 full day, because that will create more efficiency to dig in and get things done. So when I'm talking about this first goal, here are my tips. Don't forget, it is your clinical job that will often sustain your growth as a clinician educator, especially when you're younger. But creating and finding and negotiating even that small amount of time initially within your broad salary structure will be extremely valuable to you. And then your job is to make your time efficient and to use that small piece as a real seed to grow, because that becomes hard money. You don't have to go out and always get grants because someone's already paying for 5 or 10% of your time. So I'm going to build a little bit of a Venn diagram here, and it's kind of this first starting point for anyone who wants to be a healthcare educator. I kind of get into this scenario of saying, try and find some money just for your day-to-day job to do a little bit of teaching. All right, but let's kind of move on to the next step. And as I begin to think about growing people beyond this, the idea here now is that perhaps you have that 5 or 10%, you've been doing that for a few years. And now you want to do a little bit more. You're seeking a more defined educator role. And when you get into this point in your career, I think there are many different options for what that can mean. And a little bit comes down to what you would like. And while early on in a clinician educator's role, we tell people be very opportunistic and take advantage of many different scenarios. 1, to see what you like, and 2, just to get involved. At this step, which becomes a little bit more later career, mid-career, I think you really do want to have a feeling what you tend to be pulled towards. And I'll come to that in a slide upcoming, but is that more the undergraduate medical world of medical students? Is that more the graduate medical world of residents? Is that more assessment? Is that more curriculum management, et cetera, et cetera? What you're looking for as you're moving into it is you're getting a little bit more at this stage into administrating a course, a section, a content area, thinking about strategy a little bit more, perhaps doing a little bit of actual research on the subject. And you can begin to see the conversion a little bit, which is from kind of the initial steps of just getting involved in teaching, doing the teaching, showing your skills and growing your skills. And at this mid-level scenario, you're really trying to convert to being more of a leader and being responsible for the broad educational mission of whatever you're now responsible for. That includes the quality improvement, that that involves the content evolution and the adaptation to changes in your healthcare environment. So that's kind of goal number 2 as you're thinking. You're moving from just labeling yourself as a clinician educating, getting a small piece for it, but now you're moving towards trying to obtain a visible and sustainable, if you will, education position that will afford you a bit more money. It becomes your thing and a title surrounding it. So a couple tips as we kind of move into this, which is think through and know in advance what you tend to like. And we spoke through that, the UME versus the GME world, content-based versus initiative-based education. Do you need something that's very flexible, like let's say assessment as a goal, or is something more set, like you're going to teach every 2 weeks in this course on a routine? And through your work in that first goal, you've come to know, I think, many of your educational leaders, certainly the boss and whoever is kind of guiding your initial steps. And so you want to check in with these mentors regularly, at least once a year, because they will become not just your supporters of growth, but they're also your mentors to help you think about the complexity. All right, so as I'm building kind of this Venn diagram for how to think as funding medical education, kind of from the growth and mentorship of you as an individual within the system, it's this idea of first obtaining something small, making it part of your day-to-day job, and then number two, trying to grow that into more of a career, a specific position or a role. So let's talk about that second step and those roles. What should you expect? What are potential roles? Well, there's lots of them. I do like to set expectations. If you're still on the younger side, expect to really still have a junior or smaller role. That can mean a lot of different things. It could mean a core faculty position as an assessment faculty member, and we'll come to examples like that upcoming. But the key is work to continue to grow and assume leadership within whatever small area or moderate area you have. If I were to give my experience, my guidance as to what might be reasonable to think about when you start to get into having a position, a role that's a little more defined, realize that these are still relatively small portions of a full FTE, your full 100% work week. They can range from anything that's, I would argue, 5 to 50%, but very rarely do I find healthcare educators doing more than 50% of their time in that educational role. The other 50% is usually, again, clinical. And realize that you might have some support, but your direct involvement in the role is also going to be expected. Sometimes you will have to deal with some of the emails and some of the things that while you're just kind of gaining your footing, you're going to have to, you don't have a large team to help kind of create the whole system. But embrace the fun and the prestige of the role you have. Just don't ignore the day-to-day. Don't ignore the politics. Don't ignore the troubleshooting, and don't ignore the need to have hands-on time, because all of this becomes yours. When you assume a role, just remember that you're really trying to troubleshoot the whole system as opposed to just the teaching itself. There are many examples that fit into this second layer of what a role can be. And I just list some. These are just starting examples. You could be a clerkship director. You could be a program director for either a clerkship or a residency, but you could also be an associate director of any of those. And I show you one example below. You could have an associate program director that's labeled in charge of a topic, in this case, wellness. That's a classic one. We have an entity here within Harvard Medical School we've referred to as the principal clinical experience. And we have core faculty, and they often are, for example, the faculty that lead a course called the Developing Physician, TDP2. But that's like their role. They just run that course, and there's 8 of them. You could be a core assessment faculty member within HMS. You can be involved as a liaison for your area, your division, or your department for continuous professional development activities. You could be leading or co-leading or being a preceptor in a physical exam course. I thought I would list for you kind of some reasonable recent starting numbers of what these roles were getting supported in terms of actual cash payment. And you can begin to see it can be all over the map. And sometimes people need to find the ones that are a little more financially supporting. But at the same point, sometimes just having the role and title can be a very important first step to then grow you into that next educator role. So just to kind of set expectations and level set here a little bit. So these are the first 2 goals. Remember these tips. Get a feel for what you like so that when people ask you or when opportunities arise, you can kind of be the obvious choice and also convey that. Again, build those mentors because they're often going to put you forth when something is coming online or an opportunity seems out there. Stay involved within that area that you do like and you're involved with. Stay academic. Once you hit this kind of position of having a role or a title, I think there is an expectation within an academic center that you should be trying to do some sort of at least quality improvement and trying to once in a while be a part of sharing that with the world, and that would mean publishing. But what you can begin to see if you've made it to this point is that you've moved beyond just teaching. You're not just doing the teaching now, it's now your job, and you can begin to build a kind of your expertise as an educator more than just a teacher. And you should be part of kind of the national group that surrounds this issue. So attend those conferences, meetings. This is what's going to make your life also helpful if you're on the promotion track, because you will need national connections when you go up for promotion that support that you are involved in this area and you're naturally ready to take on that associate professor role or title. All right. And remember, at this point, if you've made it this far, you probably have several bosses. Connect them together so they understand how your world fits, and if your percent time is exceeding 100%, well, they need to know to balance that. I think you should always understand the finances of every piece of your job. How money transfers to create your salary is always just useful, and you'd be surprised how many people don't always understand that. And I like to tell people, and this is almost a whole talk in and of itself, which is at this point, if you're leading a role or you're leading a system of teaching, whatever your course is or your area, remember to kind of embrace your entire system of education. I've alluded to this several times. If you want a little bit more input on it, I really like this book that's called Reframing the Path to School Leadership. It's by two authors, Bowman and Deal. And what it gets at here is it's easy at times for us to look through a certain lens and understand the framework of who reports to who. But equally important can be understanding and looking through the lens of symbolically what is expected of you in your role, or looking through the lens and saying politically, I need to deal with these three angles. And so all the different ways you're kind of understanding the culture will be very important. All right, and that takes us then, if I were to say a final step, a third step, the idea of independent funding. And I like to walk through the first half hour of this talk initially, and I put it purposely there because sometimes when I say finding funding for medical education, to most clinician educators, they would jump to this idea that they should just be looking for grants that are out there and trying to find money, extra money. And I'll tell you this, in some ways I see as where it's almost a last step to most clinician educators finding their way forward to be sustainable. And that's because this can oftentimes be the hardest step. But let's talk about it. The idea here is that usually when you're looking now for some independent grant funding, you are looking to build upon your own expertise. You're trying to be entrepreneurial and you're trying to pursue your own independent project, though within the environment you've created. And dollars here can be both internal from within your department, within your hospital. They can be regional, but they can also be external from funding agencies. And even at times, you can leverage a little bit of the kind of funding from your clinical job in certain circumstances. And I think an exercise that is always worth kind of doing, almost a mental exercise, is to ask yourself this. What project would you pursue right now if suddenly someone said to you that it looks like you'd have a good chance of obtaining $50,000 in funding? And the funny part to this is if I ask a lot of people, they'd say, oh my gosh, 50,000, that'd be fantastic. But I don't know if they would know the answer to what they would use it for. And therein lies kind of the reason why I think those earlier two steps are so important, because you're defining a little bit more of your growth as an educator. And herein, you'd have to have really the idea of knowing your space, knowing the unanswered question, understanding the research protocol that's meant to answer that unanswered question, and be able to pitch it in a very effective way. That's kind of an advanced skill. Projects at this high level that have a good chance of success, just remember that they are expected to show meaningful results. The funding agencies here and the committees that approve, they kind of are looking, saying, yeah, this is a question that needs to be answered. And yep, this looks like this investigator and this project will get us in that direction, and it's going to impact others. This is not just going to take hold at the Brigham, but they're going to publish on this, and then they're going to share it with the world. And ask yourself always, when you start to get into that high level, do you have the skill set to kind of do that? And if not, then keep growing it. So when I think about this final step, obtaining kind of the separate independent dollars, some tips. Start looking for what the opportunities and grants are, and I'll show you some examples of that here upcoming. Never be afraid to try and apply for one or two. It's absolutely okay to fail. And the hope is through goals number 1 and 2, you still have money that is funding your educator role, even to a small portion within your institution. Remember, for this level of independent funding, you're often always more successful when you're partnering with other people and other institutions when you can. That can even mean 2 institutions within Brigham Health. Maybe there's a VA component out at the West Roxbury VA. Maybe it's also using the Faulkner and the Brigham Home Institute, but it kind of still has a feeling that there's 3 different physical structures participating. Remember that you're going to be the author of your educational research and innovation, and try and share this with the world, and try and, as you do this, create the most efficient use of your money, because sometimes you can save a little bit of leftover funds for another beginnings of a second project. So that's how I begin to think about growing an individual who comes to me and says, I want to be a healthcare educator. How do I fund myself? I tell them, start first by thinking small, but try and get something in your day-to-day job that allows you to then build on and create efficiencies, but you're kind of learning and doing something. And then build on that and try and get a position and role that's a little more defined. And then finally start looking to really get into being more entrepreneurial and looking for projects and research that might be funded by others. Usually I'll get the question, well, tell me where those other funding places are in medical education research. And I just put together kind of the starting point to open your eyes, and you can realize, or you should realize, that these sources can be everything from your own department will often fund examples of money. Certainly, I'll give you an example. At the Brigham, the Department of Medicine is very active and open to supporting medical education growth and sometimes research through an annual set of different awards. And of course, they are competitive, but nonetheless, that's one example. Many other departments do the same. There are educational associations that are funding areas. There are philanthropic organizations. Industry is still actually a possibility. And I tell people, never forget to kind of always be looking at your own clinical society. So if you are a gastroenterologist, or you're a nurse, sometimes going to your national meeting, you will quickly find there is a committee that is kind of the educational committee for gastroenterology or endoscopy, whatever it may be. And you can often pitch them an idea together with your committee that there is a real need for some education material here, or an educational process. If that's the case, sometimes the funding can come then from the clinical society itself, yet again, for your education of that topic area. So when I talk about, I'll go through each one of these. When I go through department, hospital, medical school, just as an example, I mentioned the Department of Medicine. They have topics like, it goes by the acronym SIRS. They have fellowships in medical education. They fund a spot at the Macy program every year. The BEI has its own Help Me micro grants. These are not huge, but every year we do administer between $3,000 and $5,000 to several awardees for their projects. HMS Academy locally has some projects that are funded, as would be the case at the Beth Israel Shapiro Center. There are grants from the Macy program in medical education, and there are also university grants. So local to us, I don't know if you're familiar with the Harvard Initiative in Learning and Teaching, HILT, and they give out grants as well. To help you with this, we do try and keep our eye on the space, collate them, and share these opportunities through the BEI's newsletters, which we call the Education Connection. And so if you are not signed up for that, feel free to drop us a quick email, and it takes you all 2 to 3 minutes to read the BEI's newsletter, which comes out about every 2 to 4 weeks. And so it can be a nice way to just keep an eye on what's out there. When you think educational associations, just as a starting point, examples, the NBME, the National Board of Medical Examiners, has one of the most well-endowed granting opportunities that's highly competitive, referred to as the Stemler Fund. But that can afford an award to the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a multi-year project. The AAMC has similar scenarios. You can begin to see other societies. Even if you want to think really, really big, the National Science Foundation, NIH, there are other national organizations involved in education that at times I've seen some people get broad funding from. From philanthropic organizations, you can look at, just as a few examples, the Josiah Macy Foundation. Often these organizations have a theme. For example, the Macy Foundation I always think of as wanting to promote interprofessional collaboration and growth. When I look down here at the Gold Foundation, that really is always about humanism as it relates to the medical practice and medical care. So you want to always get an idea where each trust or funding group, what is their theme? What do they want to advance? Because you can often find the right one that fits your project. Again, I mentioned don't underestimate industry and kind of the clinical world. There is a lot of financial possibility more often than there is in the educator world, just because of the cost of medical care and the industry ability to help support their broader mission. So they're not going to necessarily only support something that's kind of out of the blue, but if you are doing some teaching in their area, they often do see the value of that broadly to promote the better care of patients, which is what they want to do with their product as well. So they're often open at times to some smaller grants. I've seen some people get some good money for quality improvement initiatives, things like that. So that's kind of my thought process. It's just kind of advice from one person. You should seek advice from many people as you continue to grow, but I hope this was helpful as you think about growing as an individual, when also you're opening your eyes to these outside potential sources of revenue as well. So I'll end with a little summary here, and then we'll open up to questions and see if we can kind of end on time. I think that when we talk about finding financial support to be a medical educator, it first and foremost, for most people, is about solidifying your core job as being a clinician educator and then getting the hard money to support that while you also are seeking out those entrepreneurial opportunities in education. And while seeking roles and financial support in education, don't lose sight of the need to build those skills. That at the end of the day, it's not just getting time to teach, but you're going to be looked at for how good you are as an educator. And so there really is a skill set to be learned. And at any time, we welcome you to bring ideas to us in the BEI, or certainly join any of the programs that we try and put forth to build those skills. But you want to build your resume, and you want to also find your mentors and your colleagues. I mentioned to you, feel free when you find it of value to use our newsletter, which we try and create to be really value added. And so at times can be a good source for other possible granting agencies or an RFA that's been recently released, whether it be local or whether it be regional or national. It takes not too long to just breeze through that email, but I encourage you can do it to do it. And I just want to leave on that positive note that all of you are here because the title must have caught your eye, and you want to definitely try and build yourself as a healthcare educator, and you absolutely can do it. Hopefully this was a small piece of advice that helps you along the way. Great to see all of you, many of you for repeated times joining us, some of you for the first time. So I welcome you back next week as well. I hope everyone has a great day ahead. And again, thanks so much just for being a part of the community here.